So there's always this joke when somebody come up with a report and say, "Sir, we don't think we are under attack." Then we will ask this question: is this the absence of evidence or the evidence of absence? Because it's
Sorry, give me a minute.
Turned out. Hello everyone, welcome to our podcast series, Turn Out. This is the podcast where we talk about all things defense. And with me, we have...
Hi, I'm Tanisha. Thank you, Minister. I'm excited to talk about these issues. I feel like when we usually say the word defense, we think of like soldiers, tanks, and aircraft. But nowadays, it's very different. It's kind of the things we say, post online, or even choose not to believe, for example. For today's episode, we're going to be talking about total defense. And our special guest is a host, presenter, content creator, and total defender, Mr. Fauzi Aziz. He's going to be sharing about his experiences with total defense. Fauzi, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
I want to ask,
Yes.
what are your memories of total defense? Because when I was in school, primary and secondary school, I just remember eating sweet potatoes and remembering I was eating and I was like, actually, it's not that bad. Like, what are we all complaining about?
Exactly.
It's actually quite yummy.
They sell it at Don Don Donki, you know.
Yeah.
You can buy it at Don Don
It's
Donki
actually
every
quite
time.
tasty.
I will buy every time. But, for me personally, I remember, right, I think as a kid, I remember having to go through the water rationing exercise. Yeah, that was like a very formative experience for me.
Right.
Because like suddenly not having water in your home and you have to go downstairs to the truck and fill up your buckets with water.
Yeah.
That is such an interesting experience.
Oh my God. How about you, Minister? What was total defense like for you back then?
Well, I must say that when I first started to be acquainted with this whole defense concept, right, there was no total defense.
Right.
At that point in time, we were just talking about defense in the military sense, and then at that point in time, actually, it took us a lot of effort even to get people to want to be associated perhaps with military defense. When we first started in the early years, because national service was just starting, and then a lot of people were perhaps not so familiar with national service, and a lot of parents were worried about whether their children will be well taken care of. And in fact, in the Chinese community, there was this saying, right, that a good son will not become a soldier, a good piece of metal will not become a nail, you know.
Okay.
There's this Chinese saying, you know. So it's very much ingrained perhaps in the Asian culture that we try to avoid military service altogether.
Okay, that's
So it took a long while, you know, for us to get to this concept. Now I think it's quite different. Now, because I think a lot of the parents, the fathers would have served national service. So by the time the son serves national service, then the father is like, don't worry, I've been there, I've done that before.
Right.
What you're going through is nothing like what we used to go
I
through.
cannot
So
walk.
it's a different conversation altogether. You see.
Right,
Yeah.
right. So that's military defense, right?
Yes.
So total defense has 6 different pillars.
Yes.
I feel like growing up, it's always been a bit of an abstract concept to
Yes.
me. You know that it's 6 pillars, and then it's like, okay, what about it?
I think
What does it look like in real life?
I think our problem is this. You see, in Singapore, we are always caught in a dilemma. On one hand, we want to try to socialize our people to the threats that might be confronting us. But on the other hand, we also don't want to keep scaring our people.
Yeah.
Because if you keep talking about it, then there's 2 possible outcomes. One is that people starts to lose confidence, or the other one is that people get desensitized to it. It's like, there you go again. You know, it's like, yeah, there you go again. You keep scaring me. So, you know, this balance of how to strike this balance of sharing sufficiently with our people so that we all take this seriously and yet not overdoing it, whereby people think that we are just trying to scare people. So you look at some of these different pillars of defense, right? Like for example, psychological defense, and now maybe psychological defense and coupled with now the digital and cyber side of the house. Now we keep telling our people that we must remain cohesive, because people can tear us apart, people can seed narratives, people can give us false information and pull us in different direction. So I think conceptually, if you ask the average Singaporean, they'll say that I can understand that conceptually, as you say, right? But are there real examples where this was done to us? So it's very difficult, right? Because on one hand, will you share very specific intelligence details or what you have picked up? Because sometimes it's not in our interest to do that publicly, because we are continuing our operations to defend ourselves. So our challenge is, how do we sensitize our people and yet not reach a point whereby they become desensitized.
Yeah.
So recently we have cyber attacks on our critical infrastructures. Yes. So we try to share with people how such threats can come about. But whatever threats that we have identified, what we are always afraid is that what if there are other threats that we have not identified, especially on the cyber domain.
Right.
So there's always this joke amongst ourselves in the establishment when somebody come up with a report and say, sir, we don't think we are under attack. Then we will ask this question: is this the absence of evidence or the evidence of absence? Because it's
Sorry, give me a minute.
you think
Give me
about
a
it. Is this the absence of evidence, meaning that I didn't find any signs that we are under attack?
Right.
Right.
Or is this the evidence of absence? That means you are sure that you didn't find anything. Because the fact that you didn't find anything doesn't mean that you are not under attack, you see. The attacker could be so sophisticated on the cyber front that they might be pilfering our information, and yet we are so blurred that we don't even know, you see. So this is always the challenge on the cyber and psychological front. How do we keep telling our people that it's important to maintain the cohesion? Because if we look at history, whether empires rise and fall, very often empires rise and fall not because people attack them, but because they are internally divided and there are cracks and fissure that the external parties can exploit. So that can also apply to us. So I think our challenge going forward is, with every day of peace, how do we continue to sensitize ourselves to be vigilant and not become complacent? And if we look at the recent wars and the military operations, very often it's not because those countries did not have the intelligence, they did not have the capabilities, but because they perhaps got blindsided, they became quite complacent, quite comfortable in their own assessment of what they think will happen, and then suddenly something else happened, and then they're like, "Hey, this wasn't in my estimate." So I think this need to remain vigilant is something that is very difficult across the generations, and I think it's particularly difficult for every one more day of peace that we enjoy.
You brought up a point about how you have to be educated on it, but you also don't want to be too paranoid.
Yes.
I don't want to be going through my
you don't
whole life
every day
thinking,
waking up thinking,
yeah,
seeing shadows.
that's not the life I want to live.
Right.
Like, for example, this thing about, at one time we were talking about this counter-terrorism.
Yeah.
So we asked people, please be alert
Yes.
to suspicious packages,
Yes.
because all of us can play a part, right? Whether on a bus, on the MRT, or on the roads. But like you say, how do you go about life thinking that every package is...
I wouldn't be able to do it. I don't think I could.
Right. Which is why after a while, the police has this saying that low crime doesn't
Means
mean
no
no
crime.
crime, right?
Right.
So the fact that we have a low threat doesn't mean that there's no threat.
Yeah.
So this is the difficult balance, I think, that we have all struggled to try and figure out. How do we keep telling ourselves that maybe there are suspicious packages without getting paranoid?
Yeah.
Right? That is our challenge.
So, Fauzi,
Okay, yeah.
I want to ask you, you were part of ACCORD, which is the Advisory Council on Community Relations in Defense.
Yes.
From 2022 to 2024. Tell us a bit about that.
Okay, wow. Actually, to me, when I got the call to be part of ACCORD, I was actually very surprised. Honestly, because my job is, of course, in social media and content. So I was like, okay, what do you need me for to talk about defense? I don't talk about defense on a day-to-day basis. It doesn't really apply to me. It applies to me, but I don't think about it, right? So when they asked me, actually, it was in the capacity of how do we reach out to more people, to the youth, about these kind of topics. And I think some of the things that we did work on while I was there was Exercise SG Ready, and also like the Women's Boot Camp. So those are the kind of projects I was like dabbling in as well, which I think made me realize how important these little things are in helping kind of broaden people's perspective about defense, right? Because again, defense, when you tell me defense, right, I think about, okay, army. That's the main thing I think about. But then all the little things that we do in terms of, like, you mentioned like psychological defense, things like the conversations around mental health is so prominent now. I think that is also part of psychological defense. And I think people just don't connect that their everyday experience actually is under the larger term of total defense.
Yeah.
So I felt like that was kind of what I did while I was in ACCORD.
Definitely.
Yeah.
You mentioned psychological defense. I feel like psychological defense is the most important because it's something that's intangible versus maybe military or other things where I guess it's a bit more tangible.
But I guess that is also a level where every one of us have to play a part, right?
Yeah.
Because when you talk about psychological defense, one part of it has to do with our resilience, that we don't get easily scared by people. But on the other hand, we are not complacent, as we say. But on the other hand, about maintaining our own psychological health so that we can not only do it individually, but collectively as a group, as a team, to help one another overcome some of these difficult moments or challenges. So I think psychological defense is like, if you like, the foundational layer that all of us must be confident but not complacent. Right? All of us must be alert but not paranoid. Right? So, and all of us must look at psychological defense not just as individuals, because I think there will be moments whereby it's very difficult for us to say that I can overcome everything, because not all of us will be Superman, Superwoman every moment of our life. But I think part of that is also how we as a team, in a crisis, help one another, steady one another so that we don't panic. These are also part of the psychological resilience of a country, right? But I think the other pillars also allow everyone to do their part. So like, for example, we say economic defense. So of course now we look at the world, what happens when the rules-based order is no longer around, people can tear up trade deals and renegotiate. Then how do we contribute by making sure that we have some relevance, that people take us seriously, so that we will not be taken advantage of? When it comes to the social cohesion, and we have seen this in COVID-19, when our society was able to pull together, the chances of being taken advantage by other people will become less. Because I remember when I was a trade and industry minister, we were trying to buy essentials from other countries. Now, behind the scene, people are all looking at us and said, oh, see, whether are you panicking? If your people are panicking, then maybe I'll jack up the price a bit more. If I think that your people are quite steady, quite calm, then I know that it won't be so easy to get a higher price from us.
That's so interesting.
Actually, all this helps, right? It's individual action, as Fauzi mentioned, but they all add up to something. So whether it's economic defense, social defense, psychological defense, all of us can play a part in this, beyond military and civil defense, which I think we are more familiar with because of the home team and the SAF efforts.
So, Minister, if Singapore was targeted today, let's say after this podcast, let's not disrupt the podcast, what would it look like? Would it be like an attack in the traditional sense, or would it be something a bit more quiet?
This is something that I always like to play or exercise with my troops when I was in service. I always say that, why don't we red team ourselves? That means we play the red team. You say, supposing someone is to attack Singapore, what would you do, right? What would be the first thing that you do? Let's try that.
Fauzi, it's an exercise. Oh my God.
No. There's no correct or wrong answer. So, supposing you are trying to attack Singapore, disrupt Singapore, whatever you call it, right? What would you try first?
Oh my God, what if people think I'm like a evil genius? So I think, my thought is Singapore's main resource is our people. So if we disrupt social cohesion, we will destroy Singapore from inside. From inside out.
We will destroy
ourselves.
No, actually I agree with you. Because if I look at history again, right? This is what I was just mentioning. Throughout history, very few people will say that I'm going to attack somebody with a military force or something. In fact, you will try to weaken the society before they come in. So today, just to build on Fauzi's point, right? So how would we try to, if you like, weaken Singapore, right? On the social or psychological dimension. Actually, today the challenges are much bigger. Because today, unlike the past, you have the whole internet. You have no, if you like, barriers to access of information, because we are a free society. We can access the internet from everywhere, which means that anything that is said anywhere else in the world will have an impact on us. So sometimes people quarrel in Europe, sometimes people quarrel in the Middle East, sometimes people quarrel in Asia. All these quarrels will get into our infosphere. And then sometimes they will try to make us take their side, like, hey, you're my friend, right? Surely you'll be on my side, right? Then someone else will say, no, actually, I'm also your friend, you should take my side. So in some sense, it's perhaps a backhanded compliment that people want us to be on their side. But if we are not careful, then we are torn apart, because then different groups of Singaporeans will be told or encouraged to be on someone else's side. But then we have to always remember that why should I be on your side? The only side I want to be on is on Singapore's side, right? Which is we start from our own interests, we start from our own needs, and we take care of our people and our country first, right? I mean, so that's why we sometimes jokingly say, it's okay if you quarrel, but please don't quarrel with us, and please don't drag us into your quarrel.
You Do you know what I would do
What
for the
would you
attack?
do?
I
What
would
would you
I
do?
would create deepfakes. I would do
that
some
is
AI
possible.
videos. I'd use AI and
Yes.
I'd create some.
No,
deepfake
today
videos.
actually it is a very serious
It
problem
is.
because there is
Yeah.
this AI farms, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And they just keep auto-generating content that makes it very difficult for us to even discern what is right, what is wrong, what is true, what is false. Because in communications, there's this saying, right, that if you repeat the thing often enough, even if it's a lie, after a while, somebody will believe it,
Yeah.
right? Then it will create a certain momentum.
Right.
And we have to be very careful that such things do not create a momentum of their own, and then we become our own victims.
Yeah.
So that I thought is something that is quite dangerous in today's world compared to, say, many years ago.
Definitely. So, Fauzi, you work in the digital media
Yes.
sphere.
Yeah.
Do you feel that people our age, I'm putting us in the same
Yes.
age,
Yeah.
are aware and like conscious of things like misinformation, fake news,
Right.
or do we kind of just, you
Damn,
know?
this is a good question because I feel like we are very, very vulnerable to it.
Yeah.
I feel like we cannot assume that just because we grew up in a digital age
Yeah.
that we are not susceptible to it. Because I have peers who have, fallen for scams, who have fallen for like a scam where, text this number so you'll get a job, you get this amount, answer this survey, you get this amount of money. And they fall for it. And I know of
Really?
people around my age falling for it.
Yeah.
Of course, like I know people who are older, but plenty of young people also experience
Because
it.
we're always online too.
Yeah, and because I think we think of it as it won't ever happen to me, and that's the number one weakness when you think it will never happen to you.
That's
Yeah.
complacency,
Yeah,
right?
correct.
And I think that's where we want to guard ourselves and say that actually, you talk about scams, right? Actually, I have seen people of all ages, of all
Yeah.
backgrounds that got scammed.
Fair.
Nothing to do with their education level, nothing to
Yes.
do with perhaps their own financial circumstances. Even there are rich people and poor people that that got into trouble. But then we ask ourselves, then why should we think that it may not happen to us? And I think Fauzi's point is correct.
Yeah.
If you think that it won't happen to you, then I think we have just committed the most basic error.
Yeah. These scams are getting so good.
Yeah, I mean,
They're getting
yeah.
so good.
I admit that sometimes I've fallen for fake news of like celebrity deaths. Sometimes I think this celebrity died, then I had to go and Google to double check.
Check the Wikipedia page. See
to
that
make
they're
sure.
not.
Yeah.
Minister, do you think that Gen Alphas and Gen Z's digital savviness is vulnerable? It's a vulnerability?
I don't think there is a vulnerability or not a vulnerability. I think, to me, I tend to look at technology as a kind of neutral, but the problem is how humans use the technology or misuse the technology, if I may say so. So, with every technology, there will be pros and cons. I think in the past, perhaps without the internet, it's very difficult to get information. And if you have information, you have what you call information superiority. In the past, it used to be, there's this thing called the Encyclopedia Britannica, which is a volume of maybe 20 over volumes of books. And you're supposed to have the entire universe of knowledge or whatever is relevant there. So you literally can read the Encyclopedia Britannica and then you're like, oh, I'm very learned by then,
Big brain.
But today, I think every day, you will produce many Encyclopedia Britannica amount of information. Then the problem and the challenge for this generation is, how do I distinguish between what is fake and what is real?
Right.
Because you got so much information that you cannot even verify whether the information is correct or wrong. And at the end of the day, you still have to make some decisions as to what you believe and what you don't believe, right? So I thought that in this aspect, the Gen Alpha or Gen Z, the younger generation, they have in fact a tougher time trying to discern this deluge of information, right? It is a bit tough,
Yeah.
It's maybe our time we were blissfully unaware, right? We don't have so much information, so it's perhaps easier to verify.
Yeah.
But today, you see, sometimes it goes in a circular fashion. It's like well, Fauzi, how do you verify? Then you go and search some more.
Yeah.
How do you know whatever you search
no.
is actually correct, right?
Yeah.
Because sometimes they cross-reference each other.
Correct.
Yes.
No, even like AI now, they say that there's this thing called hallucination.
Yes,
Because, I feed on you, you feed on me, and then we feed off each other. Then after a while, you don't really know what is really true.
Honestly, I don't believe anything anymore. Anytime I see a video, I'm
But
like,
that
it's
becomes
AI.
another
It's
challenge,
AI.
right? Because if you don't believe anything, then we can't function, right?
Yeah.
Because we all have to believe in something to get things done, right?
No, definitely. So we talked about young people,
Yeah.
and then on the other hand, we have senior citizens
Yes.
who usually are a little bit more. They're the target of things like fake news, misinformation, and scams. I can relate to this
Yes.
because my grandma, she goes for chair Zumba classes
Right.
to the nearest community center,
Love that.
and usually at the end, all the ammas are like around a phone, and then they look at like videos and stuff, and then they go back to their households and they disseminate this information.
wow.
Are we seeing digital defense being sort of offline a little bit as well instead of online?
I think increasingly, it becomes very important. So just last weekend, I was at my doing my usual routine market walkabout. Then I saw this elderly auntie. I said, auntie, why is it that you have 5 phones on the table? 5 phones,
5.
I think playing Pokemon Go.
Yeah.
I also thought, auntie, you play Pokemon? Say, no, I'm not playing Pokemon. This phone is for government news. This phone is to collect coins because and tokens. I was so impressed. I was like, wow, auntie, you are very digitally savvy.
Yeah.
Then another phone was to watch the K-drama.
Right. Nice.
So nowadays, I think we shouldn't make this assumption that
Right.
our elderly are not digitally savvy. So the challenge that we talk about for the Gen Alpha or Gen Z, right, actually applies to the elderly as well, right? They also get a lot of information, and
Yeah.
they also don't know whether the information is real or fake,
Yeah.
right? So we also have to reach out to the elderly and also find ways to speak in their language, and on one hand encourage them to be able to discern, but on the other hand also to help them to find out how they can, if you like, distinguish between what is real and what is fake.
Yeah.
Because as what Fauzi said, it's not they consuming the information themselves, because they also become the spreaders of information. So for better or for worse, if they get the wrong information and they believe it and then they forward it, then it creates a cascade effect.
No, you see the WhatsApp forwarded many times. That's when you know it's fake.
Daily from my father.
Have you done that? Like, have you had to explain to your parents?
Yeah,
about
this is
how
something.
to-
I think I've realized that I think I don't do this enough. Again, like when it happens to you, then you realize, because my mother experienced some sort of scam.
Oh, no.
And then that's when it really shook my reality, because
Yeah.
I felt like, my parents are fine, they're not gonna happen to them. But when it happened to me, then I realized, that's when I really have to have that conversation with my parents or with the people who are older than me, who may not be as tech savvy as me. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I think the responsibility is not only on them as well, it's also around us, the people around us, to, I guess, strengthen that line of defense in that sense.
But I think it's also very tough, because supposing your dad keep forwarding you, Fauzi, is this correct or not? Fauzi, is this correct or not? After a while, it's like, Dad,
I don't know.
come on, man.
Real, okay.
It's like,
Not gonna lie. Sometimes I get a bit annoyed.
And then,
Yeah, it's real, it's real.
Then after a while, you stop responding, right? Then a few things happen, right? Then your dad might say, hey, Fauzi didn't say that it's fake.
Oh
Then it means that maybe it's true, right?
Okay, I feel a bit attacked because like now I'm being confronted by the truth and I'm going home to reflect.
no! Same. I think next time my grandma
But
shows
actually,
me
it happens to
something.
all of
It
us.
does, it
because,
does.
with all this AI farm generating all this,
Yeah.
right? I mean, we are not an AI farm. We have to go through one by one and say, no, I don't think this is this is true. But I think, let's take the example of, Fauzi's dad. If you tell Fauzi's dad, hey, this is not true, then the natural question is that, Fauzi, can you tell me where can I get the truth?
Right.
But then, so it's not just denying and saying that this is not true. Then we have to go and search and say, okay, maybe this is what you want to look out for.
Yeah.
So actually, it takes a lot of effort to counter such misinformation and false information. It's not, you shouldn't feel guilty just because you cannot do it all the time. I think all of us have this challenge, right?
Yeah.
Because got so much information coming in. And you can't just be replying everyone, trying to fact check everyone. And after a while, then which source of news you go? But I think that is one part. But the other part I thought is quite interesting is that even for established news channels and information channels, we also have to be quite discerning, because I think all of them also write or put up a video from a certain perspective. And as a discerning Singaporean, I think what we need to do is to find out and ask this question, okay, why are you telling us this? Are you telling us this because you have a certain agenda?
Right.
And then one way is actually to find multiple sources and say that, okay, we compare and contrast. Because the same global event that happened somewhere. The way you look at, say, the Europeans report it, the Americans, the Chinese, the Middle East, they all have different perspectives.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's very useful to read all this. So just as a sampling, right, if there's a global event, you can go and read BBC, you can go and read CNN, you can go and read Al Jazeera, or you can go and read CGTN.
Yeah.
They all have very different perspective.
Yeah.
Then you go and look at Channel News Asia, they also have a different perspective.
It's true,
and it's, I think, quite useful to read widely these different perspectives. Then we ask ourselves, okay, so which perspective is more reasonable, more likely? And then we can cross-check.
Right.
Otherwise, I think sometimes we also get hoodwinked into just following other people's perspective.
Yeah, then it becomes like an echo chamber.
Yeah.
And you just start to.
I feel like this should be a compulsory exercise in all schools.
Yeah.
Critical thinking about reading different news sources.
Yes, definitely. So I want to talk a little bit about military defense. I feel like this seems to be a bit more applicable to those who serve NS or are regulars. I've never served NS, nor am I a regular. How can the rest of us contribute to a strong military defense?
Well, there are a few things that we can do. We all start off with this saying, right? When one serves national service, the whole family serves.
Right.
Actually, when an NSF or NS men go forth and serve, actually the whole family really chips in. And sometimes the colleagues in the workplace also chip in to help with the work. But on the other hand, actually, I have a personal goal, and I really hope that we can expose more aspects of the military defense functions to more Singaporeans, which is why over the years, I think we have expanded the SAF Volunteer Corps. We have expanded more opportunities for people to come and even experience a boot camp for the ladies, so that there is if you like, a common lingo, a common understanding of what the NSF and the NS men go through. And if really in times of need, every one of us can do our part.
Definitely. I always drive my brother to his IPPT.
Oh,
I'm a good sister and a good
Hey,
Singaporean.
Hey.
Yeah.
Did he share with you his $200 or $300
No.
when he
Minister,
passed
he
and
didn't.
he
He
win his
didn't.
silver and gold award?
He didn't.
At least at least you asked him to blanja you, right?
Yeah.
At least he pay for the petrol lah.
I don't think he did. I'm pretty sure my mom did. Fauzi, you worked with pre-enlistees in Accord. Can you share any questions or anxieties that they had about NS?
I think in general, a lot of pre-enlistees, their idea about NS is kind of like a disruption to their life. I think that is a common thing that I've always heard. But I've also then heard of positive stories where people, after they realized when they went to NS, they realized that it was actually a very formative part of their lives where they actually learn a lot of skills.
Yeah.
Like even for me, I admit, before I enlisted, I thought like I could have gone to university and started my education, blah, 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 blah. But after I realized throughout my NS process, right, I felt like I grew up to be a more mature individual. I really learned a lot of skill sets. I feel I wouldn't be the same person I am today without having gone through that. I think that is the general gap, the information gap, I feel. Yeah, I think for me, I'm very lucky because I grew up in a household of 5 boys. All right, I've got 4 brothers with me. So all of us had to go through the experience. So through that process, right, I became more comfortable with the concept or idea of national service. And by the end of it, I was like, okay, 100%, if you can go, you should go. Yeah. And I think that is kind of one of the big struggles that a lot of people have when it comes to, before enlisting to national service. Yeah.
I think we have shifted some over the years, but we will be the first one not to claim that we have arrived.
Yeah.
Because starting from where I say that in the 1960s and 1970s, it was very difficult to convince people to serve national service, especially on the military side, because people thought of it being dangerous, being tough, and so forth. And now I think we have come to a point whereby more people are proud to say that, I have been able to do this in the national service, and then I have learned this, I have learned that. And you can kind of feel that there is a certain societal culture forming that says that if anybody try to keng or tuang,
Yes.
then people look at you like, why you do that? Right? Of course, in any society, in every generation, there are some people who do more, some people who do less. But if we can progressively move towards a societal culture where everyone can contribute something and do your best, regardless of your position. Not everyone need to be an officer or specialist. Even enlistees, you have a certain specific role to play, and if you do your job well, then you are someone to be respected. I think if we can keep moving along that way, I think we are in good stead. And the other thing that I always hope is that also our employers will recognize this, because it's very easy for people to say that, oh wow, you are a senior person in NS. That means you must do a lot of things. Then I look at you suspiciously as to whether you will need to take time off to go and do this.
Right.
But if we have the employer support and say that, well, you see, if he is of such leadership abilities in the NS, then perhaps it says something about him, because he is not chosen by someone else, he's chosen by his peers. He must have something. Because one of the things that is quite unique to Singapore is that when we choose the leaders in the national service, it's chosen by the national servicemen themselves. You cannot command your fellow national servicemen if you don't win their support.
Right.
And you cannot fake it for a while and pass a selection test, because one of the very important things is this thing called the peer appraiser, that you live with that chap 24/7. I mean, it's like they say, right? You can bluff some people some of the time, but you cannot bluff all people all the time.
Right.
So if you are chosen by your peers and you can gain their respect, then it says something about your leadership abilities, and that is something I think employers will come to treasure it as a positive sign, rather than say that, oh, just because you have taken on heavier responsibilities in the NS, therefore I'm not very sure whether you will commit to my company.
Right. I'm grateful for NS because it taught my brother discipline. It taught him to do his laundry. So I'm grateful for that.
Actually, real that's when I learned
He's a pleasant person to be around now.
It's when I learned how to wash my clothes, iron my clothes properly. Honestly, if I didn't go through NS, I think I still don't know.
So I think there's no denying that Singaporeans live in a bubble. We're so used to convenience and comfort. Do you worry that sometimes we take this peace and stability for granted?
Yes, we do worry about it almost, I would say, every day.
Yeah.
Because, once upon a time, we used to write speeches for senior officers, right? Then there's this particular senior officer, SAF Day speech, right? He will always start off, the first sentence is always the same. We have enjoyed another year of peace. then we're like,
Okay.
and then we're like, okay. So after a while, we realized that actually it was rather heartfelt. Because to be able to say that sentence, right, we have enjoyed another year of peace. Actually, it took a lot of effort, and it takes a lot of effort to make that happen, right? It didn't just happen by chance, right?
That's true.
So after a while, we begin to appreciate, what he wanted to tell us. You see, that to just make that one simple sentence, Singapore has enjoyed another year of peace. It takes so much effort from everyone, from every walk of life, every NS man and the families behind them to make this happen. So then I begin to appreciate a bit more. And like you say, then of course with that, it worries us that, will we one day take all this for granted, no? That we will always be here, regardless. But I think, to be realistic, I don't think we can expect every Singaporean every day to think like, oh, will Singapore be around? Will we be attacked? I think that might be a bit too scary.
Yeah.
But I think whenever something happens in any part of the world, if we can just take a moment to reflect and say that, wow, actually we do have to be quite careful. And in the last few months, last few years, there's no shortage of global events that cause us to pause and say that, if that can happen to that country, can it not happen to us?
Yeah.
And why should we assume that we are more fortunate than others, right?
Yeah.
Unless we can defend ourselves, unless we have some relevance that people don't want to bully us, why should we assume that we can earn our living effortlessly, right? So I think these are the moments that it will be useful for us to reflect, but we don't have to keep scaring ourselves. There are people who are in uniform that, of course, our job is to make sure that 24/7 you keep thinking of all kinds of scenarios and to make sure that those bad scenarios don't happen to us. But for the Singaporeans, I think the greatest comfort that we can get is that if we ever need to do anything, fellow Singaporeans understand the need why we need to do something together.
Do we expect the government to handle security too much for us instead of our personal responsibility? Because, I was thinking about it. If there was, for example, an attack, I'd be refreshing the ministry Facebooks to see what they're saying. So I'd be really reliant on what they have to say. I don't know. Do we rely?
I guess
too
there are
much?
some things that the government, the armed forces must be responsible for.
Yes.
But there are also things that every one of us as individuals, as a private citizen, can also be responsible for. So like, for example, if you say that, let's look at our airspace to make sure that our planes can take off and land safely. Of course, how to see beyond the shores of Singapore and not just within Singapore, how to have the radar systems, all those sophisticated intelligence systems to make sure that our planes and ships come in safely. Those are, I suppose, national government responsibilities, right? But interestingly, those people manning these systems are not just the regulars. Actually, very often they are also NSFs.
Right.
I visited one NSF. He was actually guarding one of our air defense sites. And I was quite impressed, no? So I asked him, when was he enlisted? I had a conversation with him. And he was like enlisted barely 6 to 8 months ago.
Wow.
So finished VMT, went for his professional training. Then today, actually his finger is on the button, literally so.
Okay.
If let's say sometime there's an air threat and he needs to fire off the missile, he's the one doing it. No?
Wow.
So, and then he's very confident. Then the best thing was that I asked him, I said, so now what do you tell your parents when your parents ask you what are you doing in national service? And he's so professional. He's 19 years old, 20 years old. It's like, first I tell them that I can't tell them and in details. They only know that I'm going to this particular camp and that's it. And I was like, wow, that's very matured and very reassuring. Right? But on the other hand, coming back to your question, is that but then there are also other things that I think we can all be responsible for. One is that vigilance that we talk about, contributing to social defense, psychological defense, economic defense, but also our support for our NS men and NSF who are actually in the front line. Right? We may not be in the front line, but actually when we all have families who are behind us, and if we have the confidence that our families, our employers are behind us, I think it gives us greater confidence to do that. So it's just like the NSF, right? When he's doing his job, he's totally zoned in, right? In fact, he doesn't even have his phone. He's totally zoned in. Okay, my job is to make sure that there are no air threats to Singapore's aviation. But in order for him to do that job well, I think he needs to have the confidence that his family is behind him, his commanders, his fellow men are all together with him. So that gives us confidence that when we say that we want to do anything, big or small, we are all doing this together.
But, for regular Singaporeans, is the whole me first mindset, is that a bit of a hurdle, do you think, when it comes to total defense?
I don't know, Fauzi, what you think? I think sometimes we are overly critical of ourselves being me first. I don't think Singaporeans are necessarily so selfish to say that everything is me first. Of course, everyone tries to strive and do better for themselves. That itself is not wrong. Everyone wants to improve. But I think if we look back at COVID, we look back at some of the SARS or even the global financial crisis, I think Singaporeans are quite kind-hearted and they generally want to help one another where we can. Of course, in every society, there are some people who are not so nice, but I don't think they represent the average Singaporean. I mean, the average Singaporean is there something I can do, especially within my area of expertise, and I want to be able to contribute. I think there are more and more Singaporeans who think like that, and I won't say 100%, but I think we are moving in the correct direction.
Yeah, I think it's important that we hear these kind of conversations. Because if we don't, right, a lot of the times we'd be like, okay, I'm going to live my life, just enjoy it. But don't realize that there are people around us that may need our help. And I do feel like if push comes to shove, I think a lot of Singaporeans will step up to help. So I do have belief and faith in the fellow Singaporean. Of course, there are stories. Sometimes I read on the newspaper or I watch TikTok videos. Then got people fighting, or like neighbors fighting. It does happen, but I do feel like what you said, that a lot of Singaporeans will step up to help each other.
So I think there are both positive and negative examples. See, the positive example, like during COVID, we know that some people were trapped in the house because they can't go and get food. And you see a ground up initiatives to help fellow neighbors. So I thought that's very heartwarming, that's very nice. But on the other hand, you see, when some of these negative examples come where people fight, say over the MRT seat and whatnot, usually you see the comments, the Singaporeans will scold these people and say that. So they have a certain sense of righteousness. That how can you do this? The pregnant lady is don't give up your seat. Or why you ride your PMD so fast and you go and knock down an old lady or something like that. This type of thing, it irks us, right? It gets us and say that, how can you do this, right? So I think we have a certain sense of community that I think we can be quite proud.
Yeah.
I won't, of course, we won't oversell ourselves and say that 100% we are
Yeah,
there.
for
Of course,
sure.
but I think we are making progress in the right direction.
Do you think that we could see another pillar of defense being added anytime soon?
What would you
Yeah.
suggest? That,
I don't know. Maybe like diplomacy defense. Like, speaking to
Okay,
people.
okay, understand.
Well, I don't know whether that will be a new pillar of defense.
He's like,
but
no.
certainly, but certainly it underlines a lot of the things that we do because
Yeah.
we, although we say we are an island nation, but we are never an island all
Yes.
by ourselves.
Right.
We always have to trade with other people. We make friends with other people, and in fact, now it's quite interesting. In troubled times like this. Actually, you suddenly find that there are also new opportunities to make new friends. You see, in the past, a lot of people think of defense and your partners in defense as your neighbors, those in the same region. But today, actually, when I talk to defense ministers from all over the world, we're finding something has shifted. People are saying that a lot of the threats are not geographically isolated. That if something happens in one part of the world, it will impact another part of the world. And that gives us reason to work together. So some examples, right? For example, just now we talk about these information campaigns to try and create rifts within a society. Sometimes the challenges that other countries face are also the same challenges that we face because they also have the same connected, open internet world. So that's one area. When we talk about the internet infrastructure, today, if let's say someone try to down our critical infrastructure, they don't just attack us, but they also affect the rest of the system. So supposing the internet is down, supposing, say, the cable connecting our internet services to, say, another country, supposing it's disrupted. So both ourselves and the other country have a shared interest to defend that. So it's not just geographically isolated, right? And today when we talk about things like how to be more resilient in our supply chains, it's not just about what is happening within our geography also. In fact, when we talk about resilience, sometimes we talk about how we can work with partners beyond our region to make ourselves more resilient. This could be food, this could be essentials beyond the usual military resilience that we talk about.
Wow, actually, you've done like an amazing job helping reframe defense for me. Like this conversation is life-changing. Like I will walk out of this thinking very differently about the concept of defense. Yeah, interesting.
So, Minister, what is one thing that we can start doing
Yes.
today
Well,
to, help with
Other
total
than walk
defense?
home and reflecting.
Yes.
well, I think it starts from the point that we must never be complacent.
Okay.
Yeah. So we started off with what we call the psychological defense.
Yeah.
Never be complacent, always be vigilant, and always look for some opportunities to support one another. And if we can say that no matter what happens, we'll take care of one another, we'll take care of Singapore. I think that's the strongest deterrence that we can have. And perhaps I round off with one real story.
Okay.
Yeah.
Once I had a foreign guest visiting Singapore, so we were trying to impress this foreign guest. So we brought him to see the Sungai Gedong camp, to see the tanks. Then we brought him to the air base to see the fighters, brought him to the Navy base to see the ships and things like that. Then as I was going around with him the whole day, I kind of felt that he wasn't particularly impressed. So I was feeling quite down, because so I was like, then it was quite embarrassing. Then towards the end of the day, the last stop was this camp. In fact, it was Maju camp. Then we were going in. We were supposed to see the NS men come back to do IPPT training. Then he asked me this question. Hey, Chan, who are these people? Why are they here? It was like 5, 6 o'clock. I was quite sheepish. I told him that, sir, these are my NS men. They didn't pass their IPPT, the physical fitness test.
Okay.
So they are back here to do remedial training.
Yeah.
Then he went silent. So I thought, he is obviously not impressed. I was like, how am I going back to report, right? So we went in, then we did the tour, then we came back up. But something he said to me made me remember it for life. He says, well, Chan, I knew that you were trying to impress me with your tanks, with your fighters, with your planes. But can I tell you something? One day when I have more money than you, I will also buy the same and buy better ones than you. But your last stop, it is something that has left the deepest impression on him. He said, because if those are your NS men, and after a hard days of work, they are still so disciplined to come back and train to improve their physical fitness, then it shows the kind of commitment that your people have. Wow, I was like, phew. At first I was thinking like, oh no, this is not going to be very good for my deterrence message, right? NS man going back for remedial training. But I reflected on his words and I thought it was very wise because he knew that, and he reminded us, no, weapons, systems, money can buy. But it is the will to stand our ground, the will to fight that money cannot buy. And it might be a small little gesture of NS men coming back to do remedial training, but the fact that they take this seriously is our strongest deterrence message.
So moving forward, Fauzi, you will make sure that you tell your dad
Yes.
when a video is AI and when it's not.
Yes.
And I will continue to drive my brother
Yes.
to IPPT. So if you guys have any questions about defense that you'd like Minister to address, let us know in the comments and we will answer them in the next episode. Thank you so much, Minister and
Thank
Fauzi,
you.
our
Thank you,
total
Fauzi.
defenders.
Thank you.
This was Turnout. We will see you guys on the next episode.
Turned out.